Good morning, everyone. We've got a nice group of people who seem to have joined, which is great, and already some questions in the Q&A chat that I've seen. Please do pop questions in as we go along. If they're relevant to what I'm chatting about at that moment, then I'll answer them as we go. If not, what I'll do is I'll mop them all up at the end, which is not a clever way of making you listen right to the end, although thinking about it's not a bad idea. It just means that I hopefully won't lose my train of thought too much, and it'll mean that if there are any questions that I have dealt with in the slides, we can pick up as we go through. Any technical questions as well, our producer is there watching this, so if you've got problems, do pop it in the Q&A and hopefully we can address that for you. It is a hot topic, it's a tricky topic, and hopefully I'll address some of the major concerns as we walk our way through this. So, kicking off, I think the difficulty for many employers has been the changing, shifting world in which we live in, from employees' personal perspective, from corporate perspectives, and I know from an employment law perspective, we spent a lot of time reading and rereading the ever-changing guidance. And just as we all got to grips with lockdown and furlough and understood where we were, the world changed again, and employers are being very aggressively encouraged to reopen. The world does need to restart, albeit perhaps somewhat cautiously. I think the difficulty for so many employers is that the government's message was really taken to heart, perhaps a little too well, and you've now got a lot of employees who are concerned about returning to the workplace. And I talk partly from a legal perspective and partly from a business owner perspective. We will have staff who are concerned about this. I know some have already voiced it, and it is completely understandable, particularly where working from home has worked so well for many businesses that haven't been closed as a result of being customer facing. Employees are going to want it to continue. Some will like the interaction that the office environment brings, but probably not every day, and there's been a lot of chatter out there about this changing the world of work, and I think that is quite possibly the case. You've got a lot on your plates as employers, as HR managers, as business owners in relation to risk assessment, social distancing. Employees are going to be scared and anxious, and there has been a lot of talk about the mental health impact of not just the pandemic, but we've all been locked away for a fair few weeks. The thought of heading back out into that world that we have constantly been told is infectious and dangerous is going to be daunting. So the purpose of today, those of you that have heard me speak before will probably know that I tend to just chatter rather than sort of talk through strict legal points, and I think for businesses that can be quite useful. The purpose of today is not to talk you through how to do a risk assessment, what risks you need to mitigate. I'm going to make some assumptions. I'm going to make the assumptions that the questions that are popping up are going to be those that sort of follow on from your risk assessment, although there will be a fair amount of chat about risk assessments because they are pretty much key to getting the workforce back safely. I'm going to assume that you have mitigated risk where you can, you've addressed PPE where it's needed, you've addressed hygiene issues, you've considered social distancing and common areas if you're in a shared building. I'm going to assume that you've consulted with your workforce, whether via trade union or employee reps. And actually one of the questions that popped up just as we were starting was, and I'll answer all questions anonymously, so feel free to put them, put whatever questions you want to me, is that the individual that poses this question says they understand they need to share the return to work post-furlough risk assessment with colleagues. When and how should this be done? Yes, you do need to share the outcomes. You don't need to share the entire risk assessment, and I think in many regards sharing the whole risk assessment will scare the living daylights out of staff because it points out the minutiae of the risks, and I think there is a benefit, and the advice I've been giving to clients is do a very, very thorough risk assessment and then do almost an executive summary, which is what you will then share with your staff. One of the things you will hear me say right the way through the next sort of 40 minutes, 45 minutes is talk, consult, dialogue. It's going to be absolutely key to getting the workforce back happily, safely and productively. And I think from a mental health perspective, that is going to be crucial. So my advice would be get the risk assessment done as soon as possible. Even if you're a business that is not planning on returning immediately, the risk assessment is likely to be a bit of a living document as the world changes. We're coming out of lockdown. Who knows whether we'll end up back there again? And it's, as we've seen over the past sort of couple of months, 10, 12 weeks, things change very rapidly. The guidance at one point changed 3 or 4 times in one day. I would like to hope that that's not going to happen again, but if you've done your risk assessment, then you can modify it, you can update it, you can adjust it, and it's better to do sooner rather than later. As part of your risk assessment obligation, you do need to consult with your workforce. Now, whether that's via a trade union, if you have one already, or via employee representatives, which will need to be elected for the purpose, involve them. If you involve your workforce in your risk assessment, ask them what they're concerned about, ask them what their fears are, how they think they should be mitigated, and the majority of your workforce will have great ideas, and two heads are better than one. And if that can be done via trade unions or employee reps before, obviously this is done sort of whilst you are moving into the opening phase. And something that people have raised, not this morning but on calls with clients previously, is, well, if you have people furloughed, how do you consult with them? Which is a very good question. And I think for the purposes of this, you will probably need to bring either your trade union rep or your employee rep out of furlough so that they can participate in this process. And then maybe as people come back to work in those early days as part of a reintroduction to a shared workspace, maybe dialogue at that point in relation to what the risk assessment found, what the executive summary shows, and request people's feedback. Bottom line is government guidance must remain key. I mean, that is probably a no-brainer for everybody. So the purpose of today for me is to sort of answer some of the questions actually that clients have been posing to me in the last week or so. Individuals fearful of coming back to work, individuals refusing to come back to work, individuals refusing to use up holidays. So I'm hoping to take you through it relatively swiftly. Obviously, if there is anything I don't cover, pop it in the Q&A or drop me a line afterwards, and I'm more than happy to cover it off on an individual basis. Firstly, first question that people have been raising, the thought of returning to work is causing me anxiety and or making me unwell. Yeah, and I'm not surprised. I think people will be anxious. We do have to remember that at the moment, the government guidance remains work from home if you can. So employers that are pushing individuals back into a workplace that doesn't need to be reopened yet need to take that to heart and be very cautious around their approach. If you are not following government guidance, you are by definition putting your workforce at risk. Consider whether a return to the workplace is essential. Is the workplace essentially safe? Hopefully your risk assessment will have discovered that for you. As part of that, you will have devolved a health and safety plan. You will be considering how that is implemented. Maybe a phased return to test your health and safety measures is something that I know a number of businesses are talking about. The reality is we cannot click our fingers and go back to the way we were. Very few workplaces will be back at capacity simply because the workplace volume does not allow that and social distancing. It is harder for employees to say that you've acted unreasonably if you followed government guidance. It is going to be harder still for an employment tribunal to criticise if you followed government guidance, ACAS recommendations, and actually the ACAS website is quite useful on this, union advice if you are a unionised workforce, and also the recommendations of regulatory bodies. And yes, it's a huge volume and it is actually quite daunting. I think it's been daunting for everybody, business owners, HR professionals, employment lawyers, getting to the grips with the raft of legislation, changes, guidance, recommendations coming out of various government departments. Many of them do say similar things, but I think it is important to keep in mind, your own regulatory body, what's relevant to you and to your workforce and workplace. Employees just want to know they're safe. We've spent a long time hearing that the world is not a safe place right now. It is not safe to leave your home. It is not safe to go to a supermarket if you can have food delivered. So trying to persuade people that your workplace is now safe might be a bit of an ask. I was reading a really interesting paper actually that was talking about the major risks, and actually I think they can be split into sort of infected people, or obviously a risk, the risk of aerosol infection, people coughing, crowded workplaces, social distancing and hygiene. And I think if you take all of those into account as you work through your risk assessment, hopefully people will be somewhat reassured. One question I was asked is, should a breach of the rules be regarded as a disciplinary matter? Yeah, I think it should be. I think it should be very clear to staff what your policy is, why it is there, that this is designed to keep them safe, and anyone that isn't following it is actually endangering themselves and potentially the workforce. And we'll come on to sort of some of the health and safety points shortly. Listening and understanding does not mean agreeing. And I think a dictatorial approach to back to work will fail. It will result in animosity and more difficulties. I listened to someone speak a little while ago around a different subject on grievances, and in that particular instance the reference was sexual harassment, and actually there is a keen desire on the part of an employer to sort of panic a little bit and look at liability and look at risk, and having employment lawyers sort of chatting in their ears about the concerns. But actually sometimes people just want it to stop. They want to be listened to, they want to be heard, and they want it to stop. And I think that is the same here. People will want to be listened to, they will want to be heard, they will want to understand that you've taken this on board and listened to their worries. Bottom line is, if somebody is so anxious that they cannot return to work, your standard sickness policy will apply. They are going to need doctor's reports. They are going to need to see their GP and be signed off. And bear in mind that if that anxiety is crippling, is a mental health issue and amounts to a disability under the meaning of the Equality Act 2010, then you're going to need to be considering reasonable adjustments, one of which may be to work from home. This next question or statement, the workplace is not safe, I will not return, feeds back into your risk assessments. And it's an interesting question. Can an employee refuse to go to work? And the short answer is yes, but only if they believe there is what is classed as a serious and imminent danger to health and safety. Troublingly, coronavirus may well meet that definition. And that is certainly going to be, for me, a litigation hotspot, I think. The fact that you as an employer have done your risk assessment, have worked things through, have taken all reasonable steps to protect your employees isn't going to prevent that employee having a genuine belief. And some of the commentary's been around that the test is likely to be akin to a whistleblowing test. Did the employee have a genuine belief in the serious and imminent danger? And I think that is going to be quite hard to determine. I think employers need to recognise that, you know, we've all become a little bit hermit-like well, I'll speak for myself. I've become a little bit hermit-like in recent weeks. I think people have got very used to being at home and are comfortable with that. And I think maybe reorientation, reinduction processes to explain what this brave new world looks like. Why is there tape on the floor? What does this mean? Why is the washroom out of use for part of the day? Why is there an isolation room that people can't enter? How are you going to conduct meetings? Is your cafeteria open? Is your breakout area open? How often are you disinfecting things? And I think if you can go through that with people and make them feel comfortable, you are likely to increase people's desire to return to work, because after all, you know, human beings are fairly, well, most of us fairly social creatures, and people will want to integrate and interact, maybe not on the same level they did previously, but I think there will certainly be a desire there if people feel they're safe. The key point on this particular slide is that both employers and employees must behave reasonably. It is not reasonable for an employee to simply say, well, I think coronavirus is a clear and imminent danger to my health and safety, I am not returning to work. Why do you think that? How can we address those concerns? What are your particular concerns? Are your particular concerns that there is a limited number of bathrooms, or there is a high traffic near your desk? Are those things that we can address with you in order to reassure you? This, I think, is key. Even if the workplace is safe, I have to use public transport, which I believe is not. It certainly wasn't pleasant before coronavirus. And I think we can safely say it's probably more unpleasant now, given the anxiety. But, you know, it is difficult for employers to control this. This is going to be a harder question. Somebody asked me this week, do we have to provide alternative means for an employee to get to work? No, you don't. It would be reasonable, for example, to maybe, if you can and you have capacity to do so, increase your cycling policy. If you operate a cycle scheme, maybe encourage people to use that. If you have cycle racks, can you expand them? Is there more room for that? Can you vary the working day? There is no need for a 9 to 5 for everybody unless you are in a business that requires a degree of public facing or public support. Can you vary that? Can you have meetings remotely? God knows this is the first seminar I've done remotely. And I think people will have to adjust to that. Can people travel on fewer days a week? Discuss. Dialogue is key. It really is. And be consistent. I think every employment lawyer's biggest concern in all of this is a lack of consistency will increase your litigation risk. It will encourage people to perceive that they have been treated unfairly. And I think the majority of HR professionals, business owners, managers, people working in operations will understand that actually perception is reality. If people perceive a safe workplace, they're likely to be more comfortable. If people perceive that their concerns are being taken seriously, they are likely to be more supportive of what the business is trying to do. Again, I think this will be a concern. I can't return because I live with someone vulnerable or shielding. That is a very fair point. And I think employers need to be mindful of the fact that, you know, no one lives in a bubble. The majority of people will have friends, relatives, caring responsibilities who fall into the category of whether it's extremely clinically vulnerable, or just that the employee is concerned about. They will need to be given some thought. The government guidance on self-isolation, shielding, etc. is now wonderfully clear. It is worth noting that the guidance doesn't require the entire household to shield, but employers should be sensitive to the needs of a household. And when you actually look at this, you can think of numerous stories that we've all seen in the press recently around, I think I read one this morning around Eton College has actually opened its doors to key workers who would otherwise risk infecting their families. Now that is not going to be an option for everybody. Nobody can move into a hotel, but you know, where they are looking at shielding vulnerable family members, it is actually the employee's responsibility. It is the employer's obligation to be sensitive, compassionate, considerate, and essentially try and meet the employee halfway. But a lot of us aren't going to be able to. You know, a lot of roles simply cannot be put on ice for much longer, certainly not once the furlough scheme finishes. Consider with employees whether they can work from home, continue to work from home, whether actually they can be furloughed as an option because somebody is vulnerable at this particular point in time. It is also worth noting the final bullet point on this slide, which is if an employee is not able to work because they're living with someone who has or is suspected to have COVID-19, they are now deemed to be incapable for the purposes of statutory sick pay. So you don't have to have it, but if you're living with someone that has or is suspected to have the coronavirus, then that individual is for the purposes of the way I was articulating this, are deemed to be ill or incapable for statutory sick pay purposes. So it may be that you will need to take advantage of the statutory sick pay scheme, but again, dialogue and discuss it with employees as we go through. This actually looks like a statement that I wrote myself. I'm more productive home working. Why do I have to return? I may put that to the partnership and see what happens. I can't imagine it going particularly well, but a lot of people have been very productive. Take the commute out of the equation. Many people have been starting earlier, finishing later, picking up, mopping up bits and pieces as and when they go, but without that same pressure. And this is going to be, there has been a lot of talk about it, a very significant issue for those in traditional office roles, where home working is very possible. It's obviously not possible in a lot of roles, whether that is because of technological requirements that require you to be in a certain location, whether it's because of physical requirements that need you to be in a certain location. If you work in hospitality, home working is not an option for you, but it is an option for many people if employers are creative around it. And I'm going to come back to this point again and again and again, because although we are being pushed, understandably, to restart the economy and get people moving, the government guidance remains work from home where you can. So employers do need to take that in mind. I think it's going to be very important for employers to anticipate this question. If you have a workforce that has been working efficiently, as has ours, from home, I'm hoping none of them are logged in and listening to this, because I genuinely at this point don't know what we're going to say. It is something we are considering, it is something we are looking at, along with many of our clients, around what the changes mean for the traditional office environment. Is it going to be more of a hub? Is it going to be something that people dip in and dip out of? I mean, is it going to change the world, or are we all slowly going to drift back to some form of pre-COVID normality? I think provided employers are clear in their rationale, and that rationale is sensible and properly articulated, hopefully employees will understand that there is a need, not necessarily a need to be there all the time. And I think many businesses that are looking to push, and I know I have a number of clients who are very keen to get back to pre-coronavirus world, and I will say to you all now what I have said to them, I just don't see that happening. I do not see the world returning to normal. I think there has been a seismic shift, and I think employers will need to adapt to that. Some have already jumped on it. I think Twitter has indicated that they expect all employees to remote work moving forward. That doesn't mean not having an office, it means using an office differently. And the bottom half of this slide is, provided you are complying with government guidance, you've taken an appropriate risk assessment, you're complying with health and safety obligations, you behave reasonably and sensibly, and there are no additional factors which require adjustments. So that is really important to bear in mind. Treat people fairly and consistently. It's a no-brainer to say you don't automatically allow all mothers to work remotely because it assists them with their childcare, whilst not requiring, whilst prohibiting everybody else from doing so. You do need a consistent policy, however well-meaning sometimes that may be. You need to ensure that where possible people are treated consistently, but there are these additional factors, such as whether someone with a disability requires reasonable adjustments, and in circumstances, yes, it may be a reasonable adjustment for that person to work from home on a temporary or indeed a permanent basis if it has been established that they can. I can almost, if this was live and I could actually see you all, I would actually see the ripple of panic, I think, at that point. Bottom line is, it is a matter for the employer. It is a choice for the employer to require everyone to return to work, and it's certainly going to be worth seeing what your competitors are doing, because if you push for an unpopular position, then will you lose talent to competitors? Possibly. My child's school is not returning until September, correct. I cannot return to work, also correct. That is going to be a challenge for very, very many people this summer. Usual childcare options will be more limited. There will not be as many holiday clubs. Many people rely on parents and grandparents for childcare assistance over the summer, and yet they are said to be some of the most vulnerable persons in society. So it is going to be something that will need a lot of thought, possibly a lot of creative thought. Consider the alternatives. Consider furlough for as long as the scheme remains, whether that is topped up or not. We've been told it's going to remain in place in some form until October. We're currently looking at receiving some indications in the next 8 or 9 days before the end of May to explain to us what it looks like once we get to the end of the current period and move into the summer months. Consider the use of unpaid leave, the use of holidays, sabbaticals. You don't want to get to the alternative of resignation, quite obviously, but that will be an alternative for some people who feel that they are not being supported or feel that they're not able to return to work immediately if that's required by their employer or at all. Think about the fact it may be beneficial for some. I mean, we're all going to be returning to whatever floor plate, presumably, unless your lease came up during the coronavirus, in which case, did you have foresight? But the reality is, if your lease is as it was, you have got a floor plate. If you are an office, you have a floor plate that you are using, and you are going to be requiring a smaller number of people to come into it in order to meet your social distancing obligations. So it might be beneficial for some people to remain out of the office for a period. Do consider resentment from other staff who have been locked down, are now looking at a slightly freer summer, and colleagues who are being offered to remain on furlough, unpaid leave, etc., for the ability for childcare. That is life. Furlough has expressly, I mean, it started out originally as a redundancy avoidance scheme and morphed numerous times before ending up as what is more akin to an income protection scheme, is the phrase that I've been using with people. Furlough is an option for people who have employees who cannot return to work because of childcare responsibilities, and that would be a good rationale for placing those people on or keeping those people in furlough. I don't want to return yet. Why can't I remain on furlough? That's an interesting one, actually, because the furlough scheme is going to remain in some shape or form through into the autumn, into October, as we know it at present. We've been told not to expect changes before the end of July. And then I do think there will be a shift in relation to what the government is prepared to fund and what employers will be expected to contribute. But the bottom line here is, being very clear, there is no obligation on employers to furlough people. If you need people back at work, you need people back at work, full stop. I've heard it argued that you cannot make people redundant where furlough is an alternative. I disagree with that approach. Whether you'd asked me that 6-8 weeks ago, I don't know. I might have had a different view. I do think it is an alternative. Whether it's an alternative you have to take, I don't know. If you now know the role is not going to exist at the end of the furlough period, those employees are at risk of redundancy. And I think it was Rolls-Royce that made the point, and I apologize if I'm misquoting, this is simply something I heard on the radio whilst passing through the kitchen, that they have taken the view that the country shouldn't be required to support a sort of two-tier income protection or unemployment scheme, and that in circumstances where it is felt that people are not going to be returning to work, businesses should be taking those decisions. As I said, I think it was Rolls-Royce. Apologies if that is incorrect. I should perhaps have fact-checked that one first. It just jumped into my head. Furlough can be used as an alternative to returning to work, for example, where there are childcare or shielding issues, but it's not a no-cost option. And that's where I think it's important to remember that employers retain the ability to say no, because holiday rights will continue to accrue. If people are not returning, you will need to pay those out or require them to take holiday during the furlough period, as many people are doing. But you will need to top up that holiday period to full pay. So if the government is contributing 80% of salary at the moment and capped at the 2,500, then if that individual is taking a week's holiday and their salary is considerably above that, you're going to top up to 100% in order to require them to take that holiday. Again, be consistent in your approach. I think that is going to be key. The one thing that employment lawyers love, if you're acting for claimants, is inconsistency. Because if there is inconsistency, you can argue that it is because my client is, fill in the end of the sentence any way you want to. Whereas if you have a consistent approach, albeit recognising there will need to be a degree of flex sometimes, if you have a consistent approach, it's much harder to get that litigation over the line. This was a very interesting question that I was actually asked this week. And I thought it would be useful to include in today's presentation, actually just to share it with people. There are a lot of people who just want to get back to normality. Now, whether you're one of them or whether you're not, some of your workforce may well be. And the difficulty you will have is if that individual is clinically vulnerable, extremely clinically vulnerable, you have a duty of care to them. You are obliged to take that into account, and you cannot guarantee a risk-free environment, nor indeed are you obliged to. The difficulty you will have is the employee that won't see sense, that won't be reasonable. I think it's going to be few and far between. I would hope it will be few and far between, but actually the majority of today's questions, I think, will be, hopefully from the majority of businesses, few and far between, and that's really the point of sort of trying to tackle them. Can you prevent the individual coming to work? Well, I think if the individual falls into the category of extremely clinically vulnerable and required to shield in accordance with government guidance, then yes, you can. I think you would have good grounds for refusing their return, requiring suspension, and it would be treated as sick leave, sick pay in accordance with your sick policy. If they fall outside of the government guidance, it's a much trickier one. Somebody who is potentially vulnerable, wants to return to work, but you, either through an abundance of caution or concern that they're not perhaps recognising their own vulnerability, I think if you suspend those individuals, you're going to have to pay very careful attention to your contract, your contractual entitlements, whether you have the right to suspend. Certainly any suspension at that point would be on full pay, and you need to consider making use of other opportunities such as furlough, albeit I think at that point potentially you would need to consider topping up, and I think that's something that is possibly ripe for a few problems as we move into returning to work. Again, this was a client question this week. I won't name the country, but a client has an individual who was abroad at the time of lockdown, couldn't get back. She was at home with her family, decided to remain there. Now what? You know, the world is starting to reopen. The difficulty that individual has is even assuming they can get out, they then get back to the UK and are required to self-isolate. Can you compel their return? I think it's unwise. Certainly unlawful whilst travel restrictions are in place, and you need to bear in mind the risk factors from the insurance perspective. Is the requirement self-isolate a reasonable reason for the employee to refuse to return? Well, I certainly wouldn't want to return only to discover that as a result of being located abroad through no fault of my own, I then return and am forced to remain essentially in isolation for 2 weeks. I think that is going to be a real challenge for employers. Behave reasonably. I mean, bottom line is, if you need the person back in the UK, physically back in the office for good reasons, they are going to have to return once it's safe to do so, once the borders open back up. They are going to then need to self-isolate, during which period I think they're going to have to be paid. I don't know whether the government guidance has been expanded to address SSP in relation to self-isolation as a result of returning. And I think that's going to become hopefully clearer in the coming weeks, and certainly more of a challenge for employers if employees do decide to take advantage of some of the airlines that are starting to operate, go abroad for a holiday and returning to discover that they are actually now legally prohibited from returning to their workplace. Insisting that someone returns for the sake of it, when to do so may put them at risk, is very problematic. If there are good business reasons, good business rationale for having someone back in the UK, you're rolling out a product, it cannot be done remotely. They are an engineer and you physically need them here to do their job in order that things can progress, then yes, those are good business reasons, and you're just going to have to proceed with an abundance of caution in line with government guidance and health and safety rights. One question I was asked in relation to this was, does the individual accrue employment rights in the local jurisdiction? And it is an interesting, geeky question. One of my preferred types of questions, as it happens. Yes, I think they do accrue some rights. Not, I think it would depend how long they're there for. I think it would depend what the purpose of them being there was. I think it would depend a little bit on the circumstances, but bottom line is, even though someone is employed, for example, in the UK on a UK employment contract, if they are working abroad, and if this individual, for example, has been remote working abroad, I do think they will accrue statutory employment rights in the local jurisdiction. Now, that is likely to relate to discrimination, etc., which I would hope would be limited in circumstances where the majority of interaction is not or is remote. That said, discriminatory comments, harassing comments can be as easily made over a webcam as they can in person. So I do think, yeah, that is something that will have to be taken into account, particularly if this lasts longer or continues, or we see more ups and downs. I have a suppressed or compromised immune system and I don't want to return to work. Again, very valid point. The issue I heard of this week, again, you can see these questions are all starting to pop up very, very topically at the moment, was an individual who had recovered from cancer and recovered from treatment. Treatment is historic, but will have a suppressed or compromised immune system for some time as a result of the treatment. They do not fall into the category of extremely clinically vulnerable, probably clinically vulnerable. Question is, can that risk be minimised? If the individual is extremely clinically vulnerable and required to shield, statutory sick pay. If they're clinically vulnerable, they are not entitled to statutory sick pay, and that's a really interesting distinction. There are appendices to the government guidance that tell you very clearly whether someone falls into extremely clinically vulnerable or clinically vulnerable. If you are unsure, get a medical report to confirm it. I think that's probably very important, particularly because clinically vulnerable are not really entitled to SSP if they can't work remotely. So you're going to be having to look at alternatives like unpaid leave. You're going to be having to look at layoff, although bear in mind that you need the contractual right to be able to lay off, and that is statutory terminology and only applies in certain circumstances and for certain periods. You may be looking at a reduced role. So for example, if 20, 30, 40% of the individual's role can be done remotely, but the other 60% can't be, is there a way to split that role? Is there a way to reorganise? Yes, you may have to reduce the employee's pay in those circumstances to cover the 40% of the role that's being performed. You are going to have to look at this, particularly if the individual falls into the definition of disabled within the meaning of the Equality Act. And we do need to bear in mind that the definition of disabled and the definition of clinically vulnerable are very different. Somebody can be disabled and potentially impacted by a return to work requirement whilst not being either clinically vulnerable or extremely clinically vulnerable. For example, someone with mental health, a mental health condition, they might find the thought of returning to work crippling from an anxiety perspective, and in which case, you know, if their mental health condition is a disability within the meaning of the Equality Act, you're going to have to look at reasonable adjustments, get an OC health report, get a doctor's report. It's really important to be basing these decisions on the science, she says, sounding just like the government. But the reality is, if you are stood with your employment lawyer, me, whoever else it is, in probably 2 years' time in front of an employment tribunal judge, and they're asking you why you took the decisions you took, you need to be able to back that up with the science. This, I think, will be a pressure point for people. I've heard that a colleague is unwell. There are going to be rumours circulating. I mean, you can bet your bottom dollar that the first person that coughs, sneezes, looks slightly flushed in a return to work environment is going to be a bit of a pariah, which is completely wrong, but in a degree completely understandable. I think there will certainly be a turning of heads. And I do think it's a phrase, I think probably the most common phrase actually, that employers may see. I think you may see spikes in sickness absence being triggered by somebody being unwell with a cough, for example, which may just be triggered by hay fever or any other seasonal bug. I think you are going to find people taking the view that, oh, so-and-so is unwell, I'm not going into the office while they're there in case I become infected. There are so many important considerations to bear in mind here, and they will need very careful handling. In fact, it may well require me to do sort of an expanded session on it, because I do think there's a lot to think about. Obviously, you've got privacy rights, you've got serious data protection concerns in relation to the fact that health is sensitive personal data. You will need to consider your duty of care, not only to the individual who may or may not be unwell, but also in relation to their colleagues, their wider circle. Bear in mind the government mantra, although I actually think it's changed in the brief period of time since I wrote these, and they've dropped the track section of test, track and trace. But we're all being encouraged to track who we have contact with. with a view to not infecting colleagues, isolating yourselves, I think it's a fairly reasonable position for an employee to say, well, has this person been tested? Do they have coronavirus? Am I at risk? And I think employers are going to have an awful lot to think about. Does your data protection policy cover you off on this? Does your privacy notice need updating? And I think there's going to have to be a balance between privacy and disclosure, as there always is. And normally, I think the advice would be disclosing anything in relation to health is a big no. But I think in this instance, if you can do it anonymously, if your workforce is sufficiently large, that perhaps a person in a location has been diagnosed, confirmed, and I think as testing rolls out, hopefully that will be something that can be done more quickly. You may need to close sectors of the business or lock sectors of the business down and reopen them, depending on whether you need to deep clean, whether you need to ensure that your contamination risk is as low as possible. Somebody asked me if you can require staff to be tested. I wouldn't. I just think it engenders such bad will. I think you could offer it to somebody, but I'd like to hope that in the coming weeks and months, it is going to become easier to get tested and for people to be aware. They may need to be away from the workplace while that test result comes back. Their colleagues may need to be informed that a colleague has been tested for coronavirus or has got a positive result for coronavirus, and consequently you need to self-isolate, you need to be aware of people that may be shielding. It is a tricky one for employers. It is going to require careful management. I wish there was a single answer. It is going to be very dependent on the size of your organisation, how anonymous you can be. If you are a small organisation with 10 employees, one of the workforce, the one that's not here today, has been tested for coronavirus. It doesn't matter how anonymous you are, that information is very clear and very apparent. So you're going to have to do a balancing act between your individual who is unwell or perceived to be unwell or is being tested for being unwell with coronavirus, and the rest of your workforce. And I think it is going to be a juggle, and it's going to have to be assessed, I think, in many instances on a case-by-case basis. If there is a mantra related to this, it is going to be anonymise where you can, share as little as possible, need to know. And I think that last piece may well be key. I wasn't going to address holiday today, because holiday of itself is, God knows, probably an entire webinar in its own right. There has been a lot of confusion around holiday. There's been a lot of confusion around whether people are entitled to take holiday during furlough, whether people can take holiday during furlough, whether you have to top up pay during furlough, whether what happens to the people who have been working so phenomenally hard. For example, key workers, frontline workers who have not been able to take their holiday. They can carry that portion that they haven't been able to take over. But what does that mean for people that could have taken their holiday whilst we were in lockdown, but to be fair, really didn't want to? And I think it is something that is going to be repeated time and time again. I don't want to take my holiday because I can't do anything decent with it. Well, right now, no, you might not be able to, but as restrictions are lifted, as we move into the summer months and the government starts to try and reopen our hospitality industry, our tourism trade, it might be that people can do more with it and can be encouraged to take it. Depending on how busy the working environment is, employers might not want people to take a build-up of holiday entitlement. If you have been in lockdown and you are expecting a flurry of activity in Q3 and Q4, you're not going to want half your workforce off on holiday. And yes, you can compel people to take holiday, provided they can use it properly. I think there might have been some debate around whether or not people could use holiday for rest and relaxation, is the phrase, when they were fully locked down. Now I think there is the ability to use holiday for rest and relaxation, and so employers can, if they need to, compel staff to take holiday, bearing in mind that if you're compelling someone to take a week's holiday, you need to give precise dates and you need to give them double the amount of 2 weeks notice. The guidance on holiday in relation to who can carry it forward is spectacularly broad. Many people won't be covered. The guidance now does provide some factors to be taken into account and consideration, but it's going to vary on a case-by-case basis. There is not a one-size-fits-all answer. You know, all of the factors that I put at the bottom there in relation to lockdown, furlough, workload, business closures, practicalities for the businesses are going to have to be taken into account. Happy to say what numerous people that I've been working with have been doing is encouraging, rather than compelling at this stage, encouraging people to use a proportion of their holiday, say before September, so that they don't have a flurry of activity and holiday requests in the back 2 quarters of the year. People have been encouraged to use up as much as they can, or a proportion or a certain number of days. And some businesses have, where you can. Now, if you're a frontline keyline worker and you have, sorry, a frontline or key worker, and you have not been able to take your holiday, then quite clearly you're going to have the right to carry over as much as you can. But for many businesses, it's going to be appropriate to dictate that perhaps people can carry a certain proportion, that they should make every effort to use the balance, compel people to take holiday where you can and where you need to, and, you know, perhaps indicate that people, if they are carrying forward 10 days, 5 should be used in 2021 and 5 in 2022. Yes, you will have to pay out if those employees leave, and that is a balance you will have to weigh up, taking into account what people need, what you need from them, and what the business needs. And ultimately, I think that's probably my mantra through this: discuss reasonableness and balance. And I think those are going to be important things that people will need to be thinking about. Bottom line, I couldn't think of a better title, I wish I had now. Bottom line is that, you know, you have to recognise that you can't eliminate all risk. Employers cannot do that. Be sympathetic, engage with people's concerns. They may not be your concerns, but they may well be very, very genuine, particularly if people have different pressures. And I'd like to think, if we can achieve as a human race one thing as a result of coronavirus, is a greater degree of compassion in the working environment between businesses and employees. There are endless numbers of fabulous businesses who really do support their workforce, but for every employer that does, there is one that is perhaps more aggressive. It's more about the business, it's more about us, more about the us, business us, rather than you, the employee. Risk assessment will be key to getting everyone back to work, and I think, you know, the final points on this slide are really a repetition of what I've been saying as we move through this. Observe and enforce social distancing. And actually, yes, I've just seen a question pop up, which is a very good question. How do you enforce it? Well, that's going to be tricky. Workplace police. I think many people will socially distance naturally, but we need to remember that actually social distancing, 2 meters is a long old way. And I think, you know, just illustrations on the streets recently have been that people aren't necessarily distancing in the way the government requires, but businesses will have to be really on it in relation to making sure that your workplace rules are adhered to and complied with, because otherwise, could you be, another question actually, I was just going there, thank you. Yeah, could you be liable? There's been a lot of chatter, particularly in relation to US workplaces across the pond, as to the possibility of industrial injury, industrial disease, workplace accidents arising from someone catching coronavirus in the workplace. I think it will be nigh on impossible to determine where somebody catches it, particularly if they are using public transport to commute to work, although clusters have been identified quite clearly in relation to origin, etc. So it's not impossible to think that could arise. I think employers will be potentially liable for a breach of health and safety, and potentially arguments around constructive unfair dismissal if people feel that their health and safety is not being properly taken into account and properly respected, if businesses pay lip service, shall we say, to the guidance, check the boxes, do the risk assessment, print one off of the HSE website, fill in the ticks without properly considering it, and don't implement appropriate social distancing, appropriate hygiene measures. Yeah, I can see a situation where individuals raise concerns are not properly addressed, and as a result, people feel the need that they need to leave, resign, walk away from the workforce, with the litigation that will flow from that. Engage with your trade unions and your employee representatives, engage with your employees, mitigate risk. The more people you have on board, the easier it is to keep everyone moving in the same direction. And I think that's very true. If individuals understand that the health and safety, social distancing requirements are important to the business to keep them safe, then they will be more inclined to comply with it. Carrot rather than stick, I think, from an encouragement perspective, but with the ability to impose disciplinary sanctions in the event that people do seriously or repeatedly breach health and safety guidance and rules that you implement in relation to your workplace in order to keep your people safe. Bear in mind, Health and Safety Executive will be conducting spot checks, apparently. How often that will happen, I don't know, but is it a useful tool to encourage employees to comply? Yes, it probably is. And I think, dialogue, the advantage employers have is this is not a risk that people are unaware of. This is something that, unless you have been living under a rock in the middle of nowhere, you know exactly what's going on. You will have seen the chatter. Yes, that comes with the potential problems that people will be more alive to raising issues and concerns, but actually the flip side of that coin is that it does mean you can have a sensible, engaged dialogue with your workforce. Be flexible, be as consistent as you can, both in relation to the needs of employees, which will change over time, and in relation to the guidance, which, as we have learned in recent weeks, will not remain static for long. I hope you found it useful. I enjoyed it more than I thought I would, to be honest. I think it's certainly a unique experience, chattering away to a screen rather than to faces. I hope you found it informative. If you have any questions arising from it, call me, email me, find a way to get in touch with me, and I'm more than happy to chat them through. I, like everyone else, is still learning, and you may have some views that are very informative in relation to what you're doing with your business. I'm Adele Martins. It was a pleasure talking at you, I think is the phrase. And if you've got any questions, please do get in touch. Thanks.